In Ashtanga vinyasa, we practice moving our bodies from the inside out so that the movements of our bodies become visible expressions of the internal movements of the breath. The more we attune the movements of our bodies to the internal movements of the breath, the smoother and lighter those movements become. So what I want to show you in this session is the way that those movements can take a fuller expression in the vinyasas of Surya Namaskar, and particularly in the vinyasas of jumping through and jumping back between seated postures. So we'll start in Samastitihi, looking again at the first few movements of Surya Namaskar. So first, situating the four corners of the feet into the floor. Shift the weight back a little bit. Engage the backs of the legs to drop the sitting bones down and lift the knees at the same time. Feel the pubic bones start to lift up by engaging that sling that connects the pubic bone to the back of the diaphragm. Feel the heart floating up, the soft palate releasing, the chin drawing back just enough to spread wide across the occipital base of the skull. And you feel the next breath rise through the midline. Reaching. Exhale, dive the pubic bone way back to come into the second position. And then from here, we're going to draw the breath from the arches of the feet up the inseam of the legs into the pelvic floor, uncoil the spine, and then dive the pubic bone back as the chin lifts. So the energetic pattern that's created here and that you hold in the third position is the energetic pattern that you want to keep active as you shift your weight into the hands to lift up and float back. So in other words, this basic pattern of pulling up from the arches of the feet into the pelvic floor, which is a pattern that lifts the sitting bones nice and high so that the pubic bone is diving back, is precisely what you want to keep active. So now with the hands, you don't want to take the hands too far forward, because the trick to being able to lift your feet off the ground is to get your hips up over your shoulders. If the hands are forward, you're just going to be straining the muscles of the lower back, probably without much success, trying to get the hips to lift. So ideally, you'd keep the fingers and the toes lined up, but you might find it conducive to take the hands just a little bit forward. But don't go much further forward than just a few inches. Okay? Now you want to hold that tone in the very lowest part of the belly, so the belly feels like it's really sucking way back. And then the lowest rib is going to go as far down onto your femur bones as possible. And then you strongly engage serratus anterior to roll your shoulders back so that you feel the shoulder blades protracting strongly or moving away from the spine. The spine almost wants to push up between the shoulder blades, so there's a little bit of concavity in the upper spine. And then from there, you simply lean forward until your feet become light on the floor. Hold there, and then take back. Let's look again. Now it can be helpful to point the toes as soon as the feet leave the floor, because that helps to stimulate the pranic pattern. In other words, it helps to stimulate the pattern of lifting the sitting bones high and dropping the pubic bone low. Whereas flexing the feet, as I explained elsewhere, helps to stimulate the apana pattern. So it's helpful to, as you're shifting the weight forward, lift the heels way off the floor, and then as soon as you feel the toes start to lift, you point them back and hold, and then go ahead and go back into Chetwari. Now, another point to make about this is that ideally you keep the breathing pattern nice and fluid and smooth the whole time. But when you're first learning this action, when you're first starting to integrate it into your Surya Namaskar, you might find it helpful to hold your breath on the inhale a little bit. So don't start exhaling until you've found the ability to lift your feet all the way up off the floor until you're all the way there, and then exhale back into the plank position. So I exhale just there in Chaturanga. Once you get the hang of it, you can do it even as you've already started to exhale a little bit. But again, it doesn't really make sense to go there until you've really cultivated a pretty strong lifting action already in the float. But just to demonstrate, it could eventually look like this. So as I hope you can see and also hear, that time I started the exhale as soon as I started dropping the head and shifting my weight into my hands, and the exhale continued smoothly all the way into Chaturanga. That's ideally the way that you want to work it, but in the beginning, it can be helpful to help with the stabilization of the core, to hold the inhale as you try to do the lift. So it's actually a fairly simple action. You don't want to try to balance so much over your hands as really just press the hands into the floor and lean forward, having faith until your feet lift off the floor. The scary part, of course, is how far forward you have to go. And as I'm sure you saw, the shoulders lean forward all the way, past the wrists, all the way over the fingertips. So the arms don't stay in a vertical position, but the whole body leans forward so that the center of gravity stays right over the hands. I'll demonstrate once more. Now, the best way to cultivate this action is just to visualize it as you're doing your Surya Namaskar. Really press the hands into the floor and just do the best you can to find that lift. In time, it will eventually develop, but it may take you some years of doing Surya Namaskar with regularity before that kind of lightness starts to take form. The thing to really pay attention to is not the muscular actions in the shoulders, in the arms, in the core, but that basic energetic pattern that took you into Trini, or the third position, that energetic pattern of the prana, the support coming through the arches of the feet up into the pelvic floor and rolling the spine forward. You want to keep that basic sense of upward rising breath and yield to that current. And that's what gives the posture the kind of lightness that makes it interesting. Now, from downward facing dog to come back forward with the same kind of lightness, you reiterate exactly the same pattern. In other words, you lift from the arches of the feet, you dive the pubic bone back and up, and you lift the sitting bones like this. So you do that in the air, and you try to get your hips as far over your shoulders as possible. So The trick to floating here is to get your center of gravity all the way up over your hands. Now here the vinyasa is really from planted feet into the seventh, which is the same as the third position. Okay? So you'll jump forward from downward facing dog, empty of breath, reiterating that same upward rolling pattern that you felt hopefully through every oscillation of breath in downward facing dog. So in other words, as you inhale, feel it rise up, all the way up through the heart and into the arms, and exhale. Let it dissolve. Again, inhale, feel that wave come up the legs, roll through the spine, emanating out from the heart, through the fingertips, back into the floor as you exhale. Okay? So you're just giving that energetic pattern fuller expression, or if you like, it's as if that wave of breath comes up from the feet and you just yield to it and you allow it to lift you. So you'll find that the action is certainly much stronger when you're in the flow of the breath. So I recommend that you practice this not by just trying it in your living room over and over in random moments, but do it in the flow of Surya Namaskar. So take 5 breaths in downward facing dog and continuously feel that rolling action moving through the spine. And then visualize yourself just being lifted by that same pattern as you bend the knees and hop forward and allow yourself to float into the 7th position. So here too, in order to encourage the prana pattern, you can point your toes as soon as the feet leave the floor. If you flex the feet, the tailbone's probably going to drop and you're going to be too round in the lower back. And then it'll really be an extra effort to try to hold yourself there. Okay? So another thing that you could play around with a little bit is to try and jump forward just into a piking position and float there and then jump back. So instead of letting the feet drop down, which takes considerable effort from the back extensors, which have to slowly release while holding the lower back fairly taut. Here you're just going to keep the hips at 90 degrees or so and experiment with the balance point. So you just try to hold, and then you go back. So just a few times like that. And you'll feel that lightest point is, that's the point that you need to be in order to float down with maximal lightness. Okay? So let's demonstrate one more time both of those patterns in succession. Just take one breath here. And go. So now let's look at the vinyasa that we would take if, instead of coming from downward facing dog to the standing position, we were going to come to a seated position for one of the seated postures. And what I would like you to notice is that the pattern is very, very similar for jumping forward. In other words, it's just another way of riding that same rhythmic wave of breath that comes from the arches of the feet up through the pelvis and through the spine. What you want to avoid is tilting the pelvis in the posterior direction. So just as before, in the last technique, you pointed the toes in order to stimulate the prana pattern as soon as the feet leave the floor. Here too, as soon as you jump, you point the toes and you dive the pubic bone back and you bring your feet through to clear the hands as fast as possible. So the flying position, as we might call it, is like this, not like this. So the pubic bone's way back, sitting bone's way back. Okay? Now you can check to see if your arms are, in fact, too short, which really just means that you haven't yet cultivated the flexibility that you need to reach your hands beyond your feet. But if you can reach your hands beyond your feet in this position, then rest assured that at least your geometry is conducive to jumping all the way through. Okay. Now it is possible to do this pose by jumping the hips really high and piking through. But that's much harder than the technique that I would like you to connect with first. The technique that you connect with first involves keeping the hips pretty low and far back behind the hands. So you don't want to jump the hips really high and then pike through. That takes considerably more strength, flexibility, and control. Instead, you want to crouch down, keep the hips way back behind the hands so that, in other words, you're maximizing the distance between the fingertips and the sitting bones. And from there, as fast as you can, as if to do it before your pelvis even moves, you're going to kick your feet up, knees toward the chest, and allow yourself to glide through. Try not to slam down on your buttocks, but try to hold yourself up. And then as you lower yourself down and the sitting bones ground again, you take a nice deep inhale. Empty of breath. Now you might even jump just a little bit before the exhalation is all the way complete, and this will give you a little bit more time, a little bit more room to do your vinyasa, so that with the very next inhale, you can set up the pose, whatever pose you might be doing. So it might look like this. So coordinating the breath and movement there will have a big impact on your ability to get in the pose with a smooth rhythmic vinyasa. So now, of course, if you don't have the flexibility to take your hands all the way out in front of your feet like this, then you're not going to be able to jump through with straight legs quite yet. You might be able to jump through with your legs crossed, and that's totally fine as well. So you can just give this a try. But here too, try to land very softly. Try to come through with your sitting bones off the floor. Straighten your legs out so that you're held here. And then slowly set yourself back down. And then as your flexibility develops, you'll start to work toward the straight-legged variation of the pattern. So a really nice technique for learning this movement is to work with blocks. And the reason why is because you'll find that the body doesn't trust the action in the beginning. Maybe you find this. Maybe it works without the blocks. But you might find that as you go to jump through, even though you have the strength and flexibility to do the move, one of your feet keeps sort of automatically touching down because you don't quite believe that you can do it. And if you're stumbling over that obstacle, then you might grab a pair of blocks and you're just going to put them under your hands to give yourself that much more lift. Okay? That's just going to really give you an extra bit of confidence that you can actually do the movement. And then with the blocks, you can help to sort of train the body into the movement. You can help to inure the movement pattern into the body so that then when you remove the blocks and it's more difficult, the body will cooperate with the pattern a little bit more instead of short-circuiting it by putting the foot down onto the floor. So everything here is the same. Exhaling, almost empty of breath, I jump through. Simple technique. So you can try that a few times. You might keep the blocks with you while you practice and use them every time you jump through. You could even do that for a few days, a few weeks, perhaps even a few months until you really drum that pattern deep into the body. And then if possible, if you have smaller blocks available, blocks that are thinner, then you could go to thinner blocks. You don't want to use them for too long, and so it's really nice if you can sort of progressively use smaller and smaller blocks. You know, maybe just a full block and then a half block and then no block, or you know, if you have the luxury of having 3 levels of blocks, that's cool too. But wean yourself off the blocks as soon as you can. And once you get the movement smoothed out, you can start trying to take it a little bit higher and pike through if that seems natural. Okay. But remember that the whole point here is to connect the postures with a smoother and smoother thread of breath. So the vinyasa shouldn't be something that distracts you from the transitional flow of the breath from one form to the other. It should be something that helps you move through that transition more smoothly, more rhythmically. So always keep that in mind when you're working with vinyasa. And of course, if you're doing something like working with blocks, you know, there can be a small period of time where you're sort of creating more disruption for the point of later having a smoother experience with the vinyasa. But always keep in mind that the practice is really just about following that rhythmic flow of the breath and allowing the mind to become absorbed in that continuous oscillation between expansive and contractive patterns. So now let's look at jumping back. So this movement for many is more challenging than jumping through. And for that reason, the movement is often neglected. You know, there can be a lot of frustration around this movement. There can be a sense of futility for not being able to lift up and clear the feet and go back in a rhythmic way. And because of that, there can be a missed opportunity to cultivate this strong aponic coiling pattern that's so essential as the foundation for so many of the postures in the Ashtanga system. Okay, so what I want to show you is a technique for working with the jump back that you should be able to access no matter what your level of strength and flexibility, so that you can maintain the traditional breathing pattern while simultaneously and gradually cultivating this strong aponic coiling form that will allow you to one day, maybe in this lifetime, maybe 100 lifetimes from now, lift all the way up into Lolasana and then exhale, jump back. So first I want to demonstrate for you the variation of the jumping back that I think of as being the sort of fullest manifestation of the jump back. So just suppose that I'm coming out of Paschimottanasana. Okay, so what happened there was that I came out of the pose. First, I inhaled to open the prana pattern out of the fold. Then I exhaled and released. And on that exhale, I allowed the pelvis to tilt back and the tail to come forward, so I'm connecting with that strong coiling pattern. But I didn't coil as much as I possibly could. I coiled about halfway, so that the knees were still out away from the chest a little bit. And then as I was completely emptied of breath, I pulled the knees in toward the chest and shifted the weight forward into my hands and lifted up, empty of breath. And I started to roll forward, somersaulting forward with a strongly flexed spine, now pulling in to a very tight coil. And I started to inhale just as my feet cleared the floor so that I could lift up into a strong Lolasana position. And I stayed there somewhat suspended until the very top of the inhale. And after the crest of the inhale, as the descending currents start to predominate, I followed them back down into Chetwari. So let me show you that one more time. Now, what we want to do is maintain that same basic breathing pattern. Okay? So what you can do is squeeze in and take your hands down. Okay? And then the lift is going to be not here out in front of you, but the lift is going to be here with your feet behind you. Okay? So you'll start to take the hands down and you'll coil in, but you can just go ahead and roll over your feet like this. Okay? So in other words, I'm inviting you to do something different than what's perhaps a more conventional approach to this technique, which is to lift straight up and then try to drag your feet through like this. Okay? And the reason I'm inviting you not to do that is because the muscular action is in dragging your feet back is very different from anything that I just did in the fully formed version of the jump back. What's happening when you pull your feet back like this is that you're not staying very coiled, but instead you're using your lower back extensors to pull your sitting bones back, right? And so you've got this idea that you need to somehow push your center of gravity back behind your hands. But in fact, that's not what you want to do. You don't want to push your center of gravity back behind your hands, and you don't want to engage the lower back to push the feet through by jacking the back in this more pranic form. That's not part of the jump back at all. Okay? Instead, you want to shift the weight forward over your hands. So the center of gravity will first be behind your hands. You've got to get it forward, and then you've got to coil in and stay coiled as tightly as possible as you rotate around your shoulder joints. So you have to keep squeezing in, keep your arms straight, don't bend your arms, keep them straight for maximal lift. And then right here, you're going to pull the knees up into the chest and actually slide your feet forward a little bit. So you're coiling even more. So you're really squeezing in the lowest part of the core. And if possible, you lift the feet up so that you're in the Lolasana position. That's all on the inhale, and then exhale, you jump back. Okay. So let's look at that again. In real time. Now, this way of working with the jump back is a way that most everyone can access. Maybe your feet don't lift off the floor in Lolasana, no problem. If you just keep intending to bring the knees all the way up into the ribs while dropping the tailbone and rounding the upper spine, you'll feel a surprisingly strong engagement in the lower abdomen. And that's the engagement that you need in order to get into this strong coiling pattern. You also might feel the lower back muscles getting stretched because they're really being invited to go into a flexion pattern that might be more than you're used to. So if you experience some soreness along the erector spinae or the quadratus lumborum, just on either side of the spine here, if you experience a little bit of soreness there in the beginning, don't be surprised. You know, just work with that gently, back off wherever you need to, and keep working with the form. One common misinterpretation of that Lolasana position involves simply not coiling the spine enough. What really helps is this idea of dragging your feet forward a little bit towards your hands in order to pull yourself into Lolasana. So you're not pushing straight up trying to lift your feet off the floor, but you're tucking your tail and rolling the pubic bone up toward the navel. So if I shift the weight, you have to shift the weight way forward into your hands so that the center of gravity is all the way over your hands, and then you can drag your feet forward like this. So you come up onto your toes and drag it forward, and maybe you just get to there, and then you jump back. So if you're at the point where you're starting to be able to clear your feet, maybe you've been working on that technique of dragging your feet through, maybe you can do it on just one drag, or it's going pretty smoothly but you can't quite lift and go all the way through, then you should continue to try and cultivate that initial lift, but then you can simply take your hands forward, shift the weight into the hands, and continue with this Lolasana technique. So it might look like this. And working it in this way will also be extremely beneficial for you if you can, in fact, clear your feet, but then you find that the feet always fall back down before you're able to shoot back to chaturanga. That just indicates that your lolasana form is not strong enough to hold you there while you take your legs back. So work with this technique, and I'm sure you'll get good results. Now, if you'd really like to try and accelerate the process, you might add into your practice, maybe just before the back bends, right at the end of the sequence, you can add a little exercise that will help you both with the core strength and with the strength in the shoulders that you need in order to lift up and roll yourself around your shoulder blades. This involves using blocks. And basically, you're just going to lift straight up into that position, and then you're going to lift up and somersault forward. And as the hips come up, you're going to inhale. So you pull yourself up into the lolasana position. And then you're going to allow yourself on the exhale to swing back through. And as you do that, you're going to reach the tailbone up toward the ceiling and pull the knees way toward the chest. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. You can do it maybe 5 times. You can catch your breath a little bit, lick your wounds, and then do it 2 more times. You can do 3 sets in all, 3 sets of 5. That'll really help to build up the strength. But in fact, if you really work assiduously with this lolasana technique, you won't need to use the blocks or use any other kind of extra strength building exercise at all, because you have so many opportunities in a full practice to work on this pattern. I mean, you do it probably over 40 times, that you'll probably be getting more work than you can handle. So that's all I have to say in this session about jumping through and jumping back. Please remember to practice these techniques with a sense of humor, with non-attachment, and with trust in the long-term process. Thanks so much.